Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is a request-based video on attitude part 2 by Dear Knowledge. In a previous video, we have discussed about the definition of attitude, characteristics and nature of attitude, factors of attitude, conditions of attitude, types of attitude, and application to learn about implicit attitude. And in the end, we discussed about the application of attitude. So in a previous video, we have discussed all these terms, and that was a part 1 in which we discussed what basically is attitude. What is attitude? Now, if you haven't watched that video, I have given a link in the description. Go and watch that video. If yes, you have watched that, then in this video we will discuss about the attitude formation, in which we will discuss how attitude basically how attitude develop. So in this video we'll discuss about social learning, classical conditioning, which is learning based on association. And after that we will discuss about the instrumental conditioning, which is rewards for the right views. And after that, we will discuss about the observational learning, which is learning by exposure to others. Now, in this video, you will learn how attitudes are formed and how attitudes are developed and what theories are used in attitude. So in this video, you will learn some of the theories that are used in attitude formation or in the chapter of attitude. In my next video, you will study about some other theories that are used in attitude and some other important theories of attitude. And in the end, you will learn how you can change other attitudes. So again, attitude is quite a long topic. It is not as simple as you think it is. Now let's start with the attitude formation, which is how attitude develop. Now I'll start with the social learning because social learning plays an important role with attitude formation. Social learning is basically the process through which we acquire new information and forms of behavior or attitudes from other people. Now, many of our views are acquired in situations in which we interact with or observe the behavior of others, called social learning. And such learning can be acquired through several processes, and our attitudes are affected by different forms of influence. Now, let's start with the classical conditioning, which is learning based on association. Now, whenever you hear the word of classical conditioning, definitely the picture of Ivan Pavlov and his dog pop up in your mind if you are a psychology student. Now, the reason why classical conditioning is used in attitude formation is because there are some linked in the formation of new attitude. In this video, you will learn why I am studying or I'm discussing about the classical conditioning in the chapter of attitude formation or attitude. Now, in this video in classical conditioning, which is learning based on association, there are some important terms which we will discuss and which play an important role in the formation of an attitude. There are unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus, which are common to most of you, and there are some new terms, which is subliminal conditioning and mere exposure. Now, it might be new term to some people and it might not be new term to some people, but in this video we will discuss these terms. Now, as usual, I will start with the definition. The definition of classical conditioning is: the classical conditioning is a basic form of learning in which one stimulus, initially neutral, acquires the capacity to evoke reactions through repeated pairing with another stimulus. In a sense, one stimulus becomes a signal for the presentation or occurrence of the other. Whereas the unconditioned stimulus is basically a stimulus that evokes a positive or negative response without substantial learning. Now, keep in mind, it is without substantial learning. Now, let's come to the conditioned stimulus. The stimulus that comes to stand for a signal prior to unconditioned stimulus. The stimulus that comes to stand for a signal prior unconditioned stimulus is basically conditioned stimulus. Now, I have already uploaded a video on classical conditioning. If you haven't watched that video, you can follow these links which I have given in my video and go ahead, check that video. I have given a great detailed lecture on classical conditioning. But in this video, we will discuss how classical conditioning is involved in the formation of new attitude. Now, The first process uses a basic principle of psychology, the evoking of an attitude by association of an unconditioned stimulus with a neutral or conditioned stimulus. Now, when a stimulus that is capable of producing a positive response, which is the unconditioned stimulus, it regularly precedes a second stimulus, which is the conditioned stimulus, and the first becomes a signal for the second. Now, advertisers and other persuasion agents have considerable expertise in using this principle to create positive attitude towards their product. Now, although tricky in detail, but it is actually a fairly straightforward method for creating a new attitude. Now, to start with, you need to know what your potential audience already responds positively towards. Now, for example, the process known as classical conditioning has important implication for attitude formation. Now, consider how this process might affect not only consumer preferences but also social attitude. For example, a young child sees her mother frown and show other signs of displeasure each time a member of a particular ethnic group is encountered. Now, at first, the child is neutral towards member of this group and their visible characteristics, for example, skin color, style of dress, accent. The child has not learned to categorize these variations in terms of group membership. Now, however, once these cues are paired repeatedly with the mother's negative emotional reactions, then the classical conditioning occurs and the child comes to react negatively to members of a particular ethnic group. Now, this can occur without the child having conscious access to the role that her mother's subtle facial changes have had on the attitude form. Now, the result is that a child acquires a new attitude that is generalized to member of that group as a whole, and attitudes that may ultimately form the core of prejudice. Now let's discuss the subliminal exposure. The definition of subliminal conditioning is basically it is a subliminal conditioning, and the definition of subliminal conditioning is classical conditioning of attitude by exposure to stimuli that are below individuals' threshold of conscious awareness. Now, such process includes subliminal exposure, but this is basically subliminal conditioning. Now, not only can classical conditioning contribute to shaping our behavior, as we saw in the child's example, but often we may not be aware of the stimuli that affects the conditioning. For instance, in one experiment, students were shown a photo of a stranger engaged in a routine of daily activities such as shopping in grocery or walking into our apartment. While viewing these photos, other pictures associated with positive or negative feelings were exposed for a brief period of time. Now, that was so brief that participants were not aware of their present. Now, participants who were non-consciously exposed to photos that induced positive feelings, for example, newly couples or people playing with cards, liked the strangers better than people who had been exposed to photos that non-consciously induced negative feelings, for example, open heart surgery or a werewolf, which I'm not going to show here because I don't want you people to have negative attitudes towards my video. Now, even though the participants were not consciously aware that they had been exposed to the second group of photos, while viewing the stranger, the photos did significantly influence the attitudes that were formed towards a stranger. Now, those exposed to the positive photos reported more favorable attitudes towards people than those exposed to the negative photos. Now, these findings suggest that attitudes can be influenced by subliminal conditioning, a classical conditioning that occurs in the presence of conscious awareness of stimuli involved. Now, let's come to the mere exposure, which is by having seen before but not necessarily remembering having done so. Attitude toward an object can be more positive. Now, indeed, mere exposure, which is having seen an object before but haven't seen it before. Indeed, mere exposure, having seen an object before but not remembering having seen it, can result in attitude formation. Now, in fact, the effects of mere exposure on attitudes are stronger when stimuli are present subliminally compared to when they are consciously perceived. Now, conscious memory for the stimuli is definitely not required, and patients with Alzheimer's disease who therefore cannot remember the stimuli show evidence of having formed new evidence as a result of mere exposure. Now, once formed, such attitudes can influence behavior even when those attitudes are inconsistent with how we are explicitly expected to behave. Now, let's start with the instrumental conditioning, which is reward for the right views. Now, as usual, I start with the definition. I have included the definition of instrumental conditioning. Now, the definition of instrumental conditioning is a basic form of learning in which responses that lead to positive outcomes or which permit avoidance of negative outcomes are strengthened. Now, when we ask you to think about your attitudes toward cheating, many of you are likely to have immediately thought like, oh, that's wrong. Now, this is because most children have been repeatedly praised or rewarded by their parents for stating such views concerning both the rightness of honesty and the wrongness of dishonesty. As a result, individuals learn which views are seen as the right attitude to hold by virtue of being rewarded for voicing those attitudes by the people they identify with and want to be accepted by. Now, attitudes are followed by the positive outcomes, and the attitudes that are followed by the positive outcomes tend to be strengthened and are likely to be repeated, while the attitudes that are followed by negative outcomes are weakened, so their likelihood of being expressed again is reduced. Thus, another way in which attitudes are acquired through is the process of instrumental conditioning, which is the process of rewards and punishment tied to our attitudes and actions. Now, sometimes the conditioning process is rather subtle, with the reward being psychological acceptance. Now, parents with a child smiles, approval, or hugs for stating the right views. As a result of this form of conditioning, most children express political, religious, and social views that they are highly similar to those of their parents and other family members. Now, until the teen years, when the peer influence becomes especially strong, as adults, we may be aware of the different groups we belong to will reward or punish us for expressing support for a particular attitude position. We may find ourselves expressing one view to one on a topic to one audience and another view to a different audience. Now, indeed, elections are sometimes won or lost on a candidate's success at delivering the right view to the right audience, but politicians and ordinary people who are perceived as shifting their responses to accommodate the views of different audience and may hurt themselves if caught by looking at though they are not taking a firm stand on anything. Now, fortunately, most of us not only is it impossible that or every word might be replayed to another. Now, audience with another audience with a different view, but or potentially incompatible audience tend to remain physically separated. And what this means is that we are less likely than politicians to be caught expressing different audience to different attitudes to different audience. Now let's come to the observational learning, which is learning by exposure to others. I'll start with the definition because there's a proper definition of observational learning. The proper definition of observational learning is that it is a basic form of learning in which individuals acquire new forms of behavior as a result of observing others. Now, a third means by which attitudes are formed can operate even in the absence of direct rewards for acquiring or expressing those attitudes. This process is observational learning, and it occurs when individuals acquire attitudes or behavior simply by observing others. Now, just think about how much observational learning most of us are doing as we watch television. Now, why do people often adopt attitudes that they hear others express or imitate the behaviors they observe in others? Now, one answer involved in the mechanism of social learning is that our tendency to compare ourselves with others to determine whether our views of social reality is correct or not. Now, that is called the social comparison. Now, there are two reasons why how observational learnings affect us. And there are two terms that are used in observational learning. The first one is social comparison, as I have already discussed right now, and the second one is reference group. Now, social comparison it's also a theory, social comparison theory. Now, let's start with the social comparison. Social comparison is basically the process through which we compare ourselves to others to determine whether our views of social reality is or is not correct. Now, the reason why we do social comparison is because our tendency is to compare, because at that time our tendency is to compare ourselves with others to determine whether our views of social reality is correct or not. Now, that is to the extent that our views agree with those of other people. We tend to conclude that our ideas and attributes are accurate to adopt all others' attitude. Or does it depend on our relation to those others? Now, there's another term that is the reference group of people with whom we identify and whose opinions we value. Now, people often adjust their attitudes so as to hold views closer to those of others who they value and identify with, their reference group. Now, as a result of the social group with others whom we value, new attitudes can be formed. Now, consider how this could affect the attitudes we form towards a new social group with whom you have personally had no contact. Now, imagine that you heard someone like and respect expressing negative views about this group. Would this influence your attitude? While it might be tempting to say absolutely not, but research finding indicates otherwise. Hearing others whom we see as similar to ourselves state negative views about the group can lead us to adopt similar attitudes without ever meeting any member of that group. Now, in such cases, attitudes are being shaped by our own desires to be similar to people we like. And now imagine that you heard someone you dislike and see as a dissimilar to yourself expressing negative views towards this group. In this case, you might indeed be unlikely to adopt this person's attitude position. People are not troubled by disagreement with people whom they categorize as different from themselves. Now, in fact, they express to hold different attitudes from them. It is, however, uncomfortable to differ on important attitudes from people who we see as similar to ourselves, and therefore with whom we expect to agree. Now, this was the end of the video, but it doesn't mean that lectures end here. There is one last video which I'm going to be sharing on attitude. Now, if you want to stay notified, you can subscribe to our channel, click on the bell icon, because I think there will be some changes in the timings of the uploading of videos. So click on the bell icon to stay notified, because I haven't arranged any proper timetable or schedule for uploading the videos. I haven't arranged it yet, but if you want to stay notified, you can click on the bell icon. Whenever I upload the video, you will be notified. And if you want to if you have your concept is clear and you got the point, you can like the video. And if not, if there is any point that is creating confusion, and if you haven't got that point, you are most welcome to ask us in the comment section, and we will try our level best to help you out. And share this video with your friends and family, because sharing is caring. Until then, Allah Hafiz.